Look, it's a great privilege to be here. For us, it was a natural choice as a centre to agree to partner with Nina, because the centre is all about pro-social, pro-environmental, transdisciplinary thinking. So for us, it was a natural yes to be here. The flip side was, and that's the catch, is that they were wanting us to also speak this morning. So blame the organisers for having to contend with me for the next 20 minutes. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Mundech people of the Noongar Nation, and pay respects to elders and leaders, past, present, and future. And now need to address this question of what an economy is. Today, teaching economics, I kind of thought this was fairly straightforward. I would have some answers on that. Events over the last few weeks, however, have basically necessitated me having to rewrite the whole front end of today's talk. So last night I was a bit panicky, coming up with a decent answer. I thought I would start by simply describing it as the all-encompassing organizing principle for society. It's ubiquitous. It surrounds us. It dominates everything at the exclusion of everything else that we would consider to be of value, that there is only one single value, and that is essentially financial value. And in a sense, our societal contribution is gauged by our economic success. The beautiful thing in many ways, and this is how we can often come up with images of the economy being somewhat innocent, is that it is completely agnostic about where we come from, who we are. So race, color, gender, and the economy is somewhat blind to these sorts of things. But it's blind to so many other things as well, which are structural in nature. In that sense, we see that these things matter in terms of us being economically successful, but the economy as such doesn't care and is blind to structural inequalities that arise as a result of that. So the simple answer to the economy is pretty much everything. So it seems. And now comes the big yet. And this is not just something that has occurred last week, but sort of last week has brought a few things into sharper relief. In that this whole globalized universalization of society, that it all becomes subject to the same economic principles, the wheels seem to be falling off, in that the promise of wealth accumulation for everyone has been left unfulfilled, that we have growing gaps between rich and poor. And despite being agnostic to all the things that I just rattled off earlier in terms of gender, race, sexual orientation, whatever the case may be, we're actually finding that with the growing failure of wealth accumulation for all, that neoliberalism as a dominant economic paradigm that we've got seems to be driving, if not fueling, these very issues. And I guess that's what we've seen last week. Now, we've been hearing for the last few years about the end of neoliberalism. Perhaps we've really seen it last week, in that, for one, we've been now seen for some time that there's a growing disillusionment with this promise of wealth accumulation, in that we have growing numbers of losers in the economic rat race, but that we've also seen within parties who've been recognized as the stalwarts of neoliberal and neoclassical economic doctrine to be splintering, and that we have this rise of what Gillard described in her RMIT address just on Wednesday as this rise of small l liberals who are largely characterized as being anti-economic, or going back to a kind of economics that has very little to do with neoliberalism. In fact, we're going back to a sort of very nationalist form of economics, very protectionist, being, in a sense, anti-globalization. And we see that also play out, and Guy Rundle, economic commentator on Crikey, for instance, saying that perhaps we've seen our last neoliberal prime minister actually throwing what has thus far been the dominant neoliberal economic rulebook onto the scrap heap in the concessions that are being made in the negotiations of what is now not going to be our national energy guarantee. Now, the potential cremation of the very paradigm that was actually celebrating its global victory only 30 years ago actually has historical antecedents, and we've buried it once before. So with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, then the end of history was being declared, the end of all ideological battles, in the sense that Western capitalism, in its neoliberal fashion, at the time seemed to have won the ideological rat race. But it was this very ideology that was being celebrated back then that was already cremated once before, back in the 30s and 1940s, when this whole mythology surrounding the self-regulating nature of markets, the whole idea of internationalism and laissez-faire free market economics has proven so socially brutal throughout the 19th century that, and also being partially blamed for 2 world wars, that the appetite for it completely ceased in the 1930s and 40s, with the view that we would never see it again. Here we are. I mean, economic history tells a story that Keynesian economics took over, yet, whilst Keynes was predicting a time where our economic growth imperative would sort of dissipate over time, we got politically hooked on growth. And the first warning signs were being shot throughout the 60s and early 70s, probably most vocally by MIT scientists like Doughnut and colleagues, producing this report on the limits to growth, highlighting that the trajectory we were on will ultimately bring us on collision course with environmental systems moving forward. Now, while this may have been or should have been cause for pause, the answer to this problem that was being identified was largely one of more of the same. In fact, it seems that we've doubled down on our efforts to bring us even closer to that ecological brinkmanship that was being prophesied. In a sense, we've invested a great deal of faith in a certain automatism, if you like, that we invested a great deal of faith and can still continue to do so, that somehow the markets will self-correct. So this mythology, in many ways, is still alive and well. The famous or infamous Kuznets curve, which sort of shows this relationship that whilst things may get worse in the short run, in the long run, as accumulation kicks in, as we become wealthier, any form of social inequality, any form of environmental degradation will self-correct. And I mean, to the great frustration of sustainability practitioners or theorists like myself, it seems as if, despite the mainstreaming of the whole sustainability agenda, it is the very problem that were identified in the 60s and 70s as a root cause of global unsustainability have now been repackaged and revamped and sold as the answer to all our unsustainability problems. So economic growth and wealth accumulation as our recipe for overcoming poverty and generating the financial means to fix environmental problems. And we have names for that. We now call it inclusive growth or green growth, as promoted by organizations like the World Bank, the OECD, IMF, and such like. Yet, this faith in automation has been somewhat misguided. If we look at the MIT predictions from 1972, there's hardly any computer model that has been so on the money as this one. Every rerun of that model has shown that we've pretty much, as a society, are tracking on trend. So if we're putting ourselves in the picture, this is roughly where we would be. So we're almost at the inflection point within the model, and from an environmental point of view, certainly cause for alarm and discomfort. Now, of course, it is not just environmental, or the problems are not just environmental in nature. Pardon me. We've also seen the fallout socioeconomically here in Australia, and I guess the statistics speak volumes as it relates to growing income disparities. Despite us, as expressed by per capita GDP, we've become wealthier in historically unprecedented terms. The distribution problem has become more problematic in that we've basically had the trend of the rich becoming richer, the poor becoming poorer. And this is very much also a disparity along gender and racial lines. And I guess the story of dispossession that we heard last night is also very starkly reflected in the welfare statistics for Indigenous Australians in this country. And overall, that we see a rise of pockets of poverty within Australia, as we see, for instance, on statistics of food insecurity. And these figures are sadly on the rise, despite that we're living in a sea of plenty. So, in a sense, we can look at a raft of broken promises when it comes to this whole neoliberal economic paradigm, the promises that it came with. So these promises have been left unfulfilled on the score that welfare or well-being for everyone has not been assured, even in the economically successful countries. Another unfulfilled promise is that of economic stability. Having faith in the self-regulatory capacity of the markets, if that would have worked, should have resulted in periods of economic stability from the 1960s onwards. A quick Google would reveal we're looking at a legacy of crises, which is basically non-stop. There is no such thing as economic stability. As a matter of fact, we are rescuing ourselves from one crisis to the next, only to see them repeat. In fact, the number of crises has actually gone up over the years rather than down. So in terms of having been able to rely on markets to produce economic stability, that faith again has been proven to be somewhat misguided. And of course, the biggest ticket one that is in everyone's memory is the global financial crisis, which then had cascading crises from that in various countries. If I go to the next slide, if I show you the crisis of the 2010s, are still, if you like, reverberations of the global financial crisis, triggered by the subprime mortgage crisis in the United States. So far from us being in a position of having enjoyed economic stability. That's sort of been the sort of more big picture outlook on things. On matters closer to home, Western Australia also had to contend with its own economic problems, and actually ever since the arrival of white colonizers, the state has sort of struggled a little bit and always looked very envious across to the eastern seaboard, where economic activity seems to be going full steam ahead, and we were always facing this problem of what perceived to be chronic underdevelopment. So we had this sort of Cinderella state syndrome, as the late historian Bolton would describe Western Australia. Now, that has triggered a certain development paradigm within Western Australia in the late 60s, early 70s, where we basically signed up to developmentalism, where resource development, in particular over the last 20-odd years, was meant to be that rising tide that was to lift all boats within Western Australia. Now, while I will conclude here in a minute saying that we haven't really moved on a great deal, that is not to say that Western Australia hasn't had its progressive moments. In the late 80s, we had a climate conference in Busselton. We even had greenhouse gas emission reduction targets for the state. We had a state sustainability strategy under the Gallop government. We had moments, and Murdoch was a co-architect of that strategy. So we had moments of progressive thought. But in the final conclusion, there has never been the political will or appetite to see that through and give it the requisite policy backing. So in terms of brief economic history of Western Australia, we designed a development system that very much relies on foreign direct investment to drive large mega resource development projects with the support of the state, and to largely drive development, especially up north, where we have highest levels of economic underdevelopment. That was always the argument. Now, industry has done what it did. It became more professional in its approach. It de-unionized the north. It naturalized, or normalized, I should say, what were once company towns, and threw itself into the game of becoming a major supplier of raw materials for global economy. So we are fully embedded these days in a global production network. If we look at development today, it's still very much is an adherence to what the late Charles Court had in mind in the 1970s when we as a state embarked on developmentalism. And we still haven't moved on from that idea. There's still the single most dominant development narrative that we've got in the state, which becomes particularly obvious when we sort of look at the Barnett years in Western Australia, when we were riding, if you like, the resource boom at its highest. It has become pretty much a political preoccupation by government to just facilitate that type of growth and that particular type of development, that it became the personal responsibility of the Premier to make sure that nothing shall stand in its way. So a very strong political conviction in that particular development narrative. And it seemed attractive. Riding the Chinese dragon's tail for 30 years, that was the hope. We hoped that this boom would last for 30 years. That was the promise. And with it came high hopes for income generation, revenue generation, prosperity for all, and employment, especially for Indigenous Australians. So everybody was meant to be better off in the long term. The assumption was that, A, the boom would last, that we would at last see development up north in areas that have been chronically underdeveloped, and that the wealth that would be accumulated would magically trickle down, and that this wealth accumulation would automatically lead to a better life for people living in Western Australia. Now, we looked into this as part of a collaborative study done by members of the Centre, and what we found is that the state didn't cope too well. We've made an awful lot of money in a very short period of time, that is for sure, but the centres of activity, especially up north, could hardly cope with the investment volume that was pumped into those regions. So we had these boomtown syndromes in places like Carnarvon, Karratha, Port Hedland, you name it. Now, industry moving closer to communities also meant that industry-community conflict became more pre-programmed. It was a matter of course that a large-scale industrial activity would get in the way of communities, or put the other way, that communities would get in the way of development. And we've also seen that play out in land right conflicts between Indigenous landowners and in industry interests, where the state also played a very active role. What we've also found is that the richest postcodes, so where the highest per capita incomes were being realized, were also the places where the highest income discrepancies or income divisions, if you like, could be observed in places like Roebourne. And of course, we're looking at very large environmental footprints and legacy effects consequent to mining, all of which were on the rise as a result of basically period of resource development on steroids. And again, we looked at a whole sway of unfulfilled promises. While industry was arguing itself black and blue in the face that we would create jobs for Indigenous Australians, there's no statistical evidence for that. In fact, what we had was a case of labour relocation, that people already employed may went to places where high incomes could be realised, but it didn't lead to net increases in Indigenous employment. Other sectors were adversely affected by the mining boom. And so we even had crowding out effects and, for instance, conflicts between tourism operators and mining companies. And that overall, as a society in Western Australia, and I think we can all attest to that, look at our back pockets, that life has become simply more expensive consequent to this kind of boom. That cost of living expenses went up, disproportionately affecting those financially less well off. So on the question, was it good, was it bad? It's very much a mixed bag. Yes, we made an awful lot of money, but that money was not trickling down. Economic diffusion or wealth diffusion did not occur. The money stayed within the industry or went to shareholders abroad. We had a dominance of economic values in that the government made it its policy priority to drive that growth. That was very much at the expense of of community interests, and the environmental movement will also be able to attest to the fact that environmental interests were not being upheld. In fact, they were being overridden. So community well-being arguably put at risk by development at all cost. And that we've also seen that there was a lack of imagination when it comes to crafting a development narrative that entertains ideas that go beyond resource development. And I think we are now in a position of judging that with the advantage of hindsight, realizing the failure of not having diversified the economy. So the bust came, and the greatest irony of them all is that even though it was a historically unprecedented era of wealth generation, the government coffers are empty. Where we have a whole raft of white elephants in the regions, underutilized or unfinished infrastructure development projects up north. People have left in droves. So the cities that were looking at the prospect of a doubling of population size had, population reductions by over half. We have spending cuts in vital areas like education, which I believe is criminal, because there is no money. And the Cinderella state could hold its head up high, very high, in 2012, being the economic powerhouse of the nation, whereas now we're trailing national growth statistics nationally, economic growth statistics nationally. So the good news is Deloitte tells us that we're back on the bike. We've gone through the trough and economic growth is just around the corner. It's a big question, though, as to whether the very structural issues that I've identified earlier could be addressed by a recovery of growth figures to the tune of 3 or 4%. The good news is, and I guess attested to by attendance here today, that there's a growing appetite for change. People ask different questions of the economy and ask questions that go well beyond the economy. And also started doing things their own way because state or federal leaders failed to deliver on the economic promise that was being made. In many ways, we see that nationally, locally, but also internationally, attempts are being made at inoculation, where people trying to build safety nets of their own because the national or global system can't be relied upon. And we've seen the vagaries of the market. I've shown you the crisis figures. There is no such thing as stability. So we have transition towns, relocalization efforts, all attempts at people doing it their own way, things that work for them at a scale that they can control. And I think we will hear more exciting examples of that sort throughout the day. What is also interesting, but completely anathema just a few years ago, is that all of a sudden notions of post-growth, degrowth, post-capitalism, and various variations of those themes have now traction. Not just in academic circles, but even politicians are now across the Atlantic and around the Western world are, for instance, talking about a basic wage as a potential way of dealing with the specter of long-term chronic high levels of unemployment, as long-term growth forecasts are reasonably flat. So how are we going to generate income in years to come? So we want a new economics, but we want so much more. It is not just a matter of having a better economics. The tools are there. It's just these schools of economic thought have never been listened to, but it's not that they haven't existed. But we need overall a complete reappraisal of our relationship with nature. We need different types of literacies, that we have a better understanding of ecological process, better understanding of human behavior, better understanding of social processes, and a recognition is that a plurality of perspective is needed to get onto more sustainable pastures. We heard yesterday that indigenous knowledges have been completely wiped out in many parts of the world or have simply been disregarded. We can't do without them. We have branches of ethno-economics, for instance, that inform our economic thought. But as I said before, and it goes beyond that as well. It is not just a matter of a different type of economic thinking. We need a whole different thought paradigm, perhaps entirely. One that recenters us as a central concern of matters economic. That was the driving force to begin with. That was meant to improve the human lot. But we've become subservient to a national or global economy. It's a matter of reversing that formula. But not just making it about humankind, but make it about planetary thriving. as the Doughnut Economic approach, for instance, by Kate Raworth would indicate. It's about living well for everyone, human, non-human, within environmental boundaries. My students always say, well, how do we get there? This sounds very nice. And my answer is, well, it's just a stroke of a pen. We just have to change a few assumptions in many ways. It started with assumptions. It's just a book that is the very basics of microeconomic thought, which is now the dominant social paradigm. It's a stroke of a pen. We can rewrite those books. So the past and the present is socially constructed. So all the problems of unsustainability that I sort of canvassed earlier, they're human-made. So the economy is not a given. It's a social construct. So in that sense, the answer, what is an economy and what is a better economy, is something that we imagine, something that we want, and it's also something that we can create. And I guess that's what today is for. Thank you.